Well, the rosters are set for Saturday's Blue Gold game in Acrisure Stadium, and you might be asking yourself, can you actually spend 20 minutes talking about the rosters for a spring game? Oh, you bet your sweet behind I can. I can spend 20 minutes or more talking about the rosters for a Blue Gold game for a spring game. After the Pitt players held their draft yesterday in the South Side, you better believe I can spend 20 minutes talking about that. But it's not all just me, blabbering on and extending and saying things in 20 minutes. It could be said in 10. There's actually a lot to watch for on Saturday. So we're going to talk about the rosters today, the Blue Gold game rosters, and what you need to be watching for if you go down to Acrisure Stadium on Saturday. What to keep an eye on at the Blue Gold game. There's going to be a lot of interesting elements. And we're going to cover as many as we can here today in this 20-minute allotment on the what is this thing called? The Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, welcome to the Thursday edition of the Morning Pitt here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, the Pitt video channel with all the Pitt video content, everything we've got, Morning Pitt videos, live shows like we did last night with Jim Hammett. And, of course, press conferences, interviews, practice highlights, all those things right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So like we always ask you to do, like and subscribe. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com, the website where we had all kinds of coverage of the Blue Gold draft yesterday. Look, coverage is what you make of it. Could you possibly spend a lot of time covering the draft for a spring game? Absolutely we could, and we did. We had a lot of coverage from it. Ran down, had a live thread going with all the picks, a little bit of analysis thrown in there. We've projected two deeps, and it's all right there at Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Go to Panther-Lair.com for all the info. That's the best source of Pitt sports news on the internet. Before we jump into the spring game, though, we have to give a quick shout out to the news about Ishmael Leggett. Leggett had the tweet yesterday, I guess came from the Pitt basketball account, that Ishmael Leggett has unfinished business. He's coming back for another year. This is what we expected. We said this, for the last couple of weeks. We said we expect, the last week or two, that we expect Jalen Lowe and Ishmael Leggett both to return. Bub Carrington was the wild card or the unknown, but he ultimately made his announcement last week when he decided he's going into the NBA. Jalen Lowe announced that he's coming back late last week, and then Ishmael Leggett made his announcement yesterday. We talked a lot, actually yesterday, earlier in the day on the Morning Pitt, about what, how the roster was shaping up. And I actually made a mistake. I said there were 3 spots available for transfers. There's actually 4. There's only 4 spots left. I kept forgetting about the Michael Hewitt scholarship. That's what kept throwing me off. So they've got 4 spots to fill. And certainly with Ishmael Leggett locked in and returning, that sort of further solidifies what they have available as far as scholarship spots and what they need as far as positions. Still need to get, I think, a 2-guard. Still need to get a 4 and still need to get a 5. They've got some really nice pieces with Jalen Lowe and Ishmael Leggett. I think Zach Austin can be a good fit depending on what you're asking him to do. I think the Diaz-Graham twins can be good contributing players depending on what you're asking them to do. Getting Ishmael Leggett back is a big piece of the puzzle. And I think Lowe and Leggett form a great foundation for this team in the backcourt. And you have to build from there. You have to add a power forward. You'd like to add another center to go in the mix. But having Lowe and Leggett to start things off in the backcourt, I mean, that's a great foundation for this team. And those guys, just the 2 of them, will win you a lot of basketball games. To win as many as you actually want to win, you're going to need a few more pieces to add in. But those 2 are a great start. Lowe and Leggett as the foundation of the backcourt. You could do a lot worse, and there aren't a lot of teams that'll do that much better. I mean, there will be teams with better backcourts, but Lowe and Leggett are a great duo to have back there. And, of course, there's a lot of conversation about that right now on Panther-Lair.com. You see the website below, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. And if you skipped ahead from the beginning and you ended up at this spot, you say, oh, God, is he still talking about the website? No, we've been talking about Ishmael Leggett for a little while. So I hope you didn't skip over that. You might have to go back and check that out. But as I was saying, there's a lot of conversation. Pitt fans talking on Panther-Lair.com right now about everything going on with Ishmael Leggett returning. And then, of course, on the football side, talking about the Blue Gold game. Now, if you had forgotten how the format works for choosing the rosters for the spring game, it was what Panarduzzi did for his first 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 5 seasons. Didn't do it in 2020 because they didn't have a spring game in 2020. Did it again in 2021 and 22. Didn't do it last year. Changed the format last year. What they did for those first 5 seasons and then the next 2 after that, after 2020, is they held a draft. And the way the draft works, and I mean, I think a lot of the readers on Panther-Lair.com know about this, but I think there's probably a lot of people watching this video or even people listening to the audio podcast who are maybe not aware of what it is or what the format is. But what the coaches do is they draft the teams, and the way they break the team up into the blue team and the gold team, they start off by naming head coaches of each side. So this year, I think Jacob Bernowski, the new tight ends coach and special teams coordinator, is the head coach of the blue team. Archie Collins, the defensive backs coach, is the head coach of the gold team. And then from there, the coaches draft out the head coach. Those guys, the head coaches, draft out the rest of the coaching staff. I think in the past it was the coordinators drafted out, but either way. So those guys, Bernowski and Collins, drafted out the rest of the coaching staff, and then now you've got a full coaching staff on each side. You've got 5 guys or whatever, and then each team then drafts out the seniors. So they walk into the proper draft on yesterday afternoon, with all the seniors already assigned to teams and all the coaches assigned to teams. And then the seniors or the captains of each team will sit down there on draft day, which was yesterday, and draft out the rest of the roster. The way they work the draft, just to make sure it's all even, so you don't just sit there and stockpile all the quarterbacks and leave the other team without any quarterbacks. They go by position. So I think the gold team drafted first. They won the first pick. It was a rock, paper, scissors to decide who got to call the coin toss. And then the coin toss was to decide if you want to take the first pick or defer and take the second and third picks. So whatever. So the gold team went first. They opened with I think it's the Z wide receivers, or the X wide receivers. And they took Kenny Johnson. We'll talk about that in a second. But then all of the whatever was X wide receivers get drafted. So they go through the whole position. So each round is a position rather than sort of player by player, team by team. Does that make sense? And it's logical to keep everything sort of balanced in terms of numbers at each position between the two teams if they go sort of position by position. Now, one thing that so last year, one of the biggest gripes throughout the time is that you ended up with mismatched offensive line. And we always would talk about it here on our shows and our live shows and podcasts and things like that. You would end up with these mismatched offensive linemen. So you'd have guys that hadn't been working together all spring. Now, because of this draft format, would end up working together. And we sort of blamed the poor offensive product and general boringness of the spring game on the mismatched offensive line. In addition to the fact that they're running a pretty vanilla offense during these things because they don't want to put anything on tape. So last year they changed it up, and instead of going blue versus gold, blue team versus gold team, they went offense versus defense and just kept all the units together. It was ones versus ones and twos versus twos, and they had their defensive scoring system, and they see who won. Well, this year they're back to the draft. They're back to the draft format with a little bit of a wrinkle that the coaches before the draft assigned all of the offensive linemen to one team or another. So I think the gold team ended up with largely the first team offense. I have my projected 2 deep in front of me here. Yeah, the gold team largely ended up with the projected first team offensive line, with a few exceptions, but just due to injury. And then the blue team ended up with more or less the second team, or what would constitute the second team, given the current availability. So they sort of took some of that element out of it, which I think was probably a good decision. And then they went forward and drafted the rest of the teams, and that's where we stand today. The blue team has its roster, the gold team has its roster, and there are a lot of interesting things to see and observe about that. The first thing that we have to talk about, though, are the guys who aren't going to be playing on Saturday. By my count, I believe 19 players are officially out. 5 more are probable, and 1 is questionable. The guys who are out, 5 wide receivers: Sincere Lee, Trey Wabuko, Raphael Williams, Peter Vardzell, and Benny Hasselrig. 3 linebackers: Jordan Bass, Solomon DeShields, and Key Thompson. 2 corners: Shadarian Harrison and Tamon Lynham. 2 DNs: Zach Crothers and Nate Temple. Temple's out for the whole year. Defensive tackle Thomas Aiden, running back Rodney Hammond, and 4 offensive linemen: Dorian Ford, Terrence Moore, Ryan Jacoby, and Branson Taylor. Oh, and a safety named Cruz Brookins, who might be one of the few names, might be the name that has been spoken the most over the course of 5 weeks of spring camp. Cruz Brookins from Steel Valley, a redshirt freshman who has just been an absolute, by all accounts, stud this spring. I wrote about this on Tuesday on Panther-Lair.com with our spring camp report. After each practice, we have a spring camp report right there at Panther-Lair.com. It's for subscribers only, but it's an inside look at everything we're hearing and seeing and picking up on around spring camp. We've had a lot of stuff in there. I mean, something we're to talk about coming up in a minute here about the quarterbacks. We had in there a couple weeks ago about a potential move in the quarterback depth, which seems like it came to fruition and seemed like it was pretty accurate. We had it right there at Panther-Lair.com. So hopefully if you're a Pitt fan, you've been following along in our coverage there. So on Tuesday, I forgot where I was going with that. On Tuesday, when I wrote our spring camp report for Panther-Lair.com, I talked about how they put these takeaway stickers on the defensive players' helmets. When they get a turnover in practice, they get a takeaway sticker. And some of these guys are building up 2-3 takeaway stickers. They've been really making plays. Cruz Brookins, I actually couldn't count how many he had on his helmet. There were so many, and they were overlapped and covering. There was at least 5 for sure. Might have been 6, and might have even been 7 turnovers through like 11 practices. It's a remarkable number. Or maybe 12 practices, whatever it ended up being. No, 13, I guess. just tried to do the math real quick on how many practices. Today they'll have practice number 14. The spring game will be practice number 15. So that was heading into practice number 13. Brookins had like 7 turnovers forced in spring camp thus far, which is really impressive. And when we talked to Nate Matlack, the senior defensive end who transferred from Kansas State, we talked to him on Tuesday. We asked him who would he take as the first overall pick, and he said on defense I would go with Cruz because he's just making so many plays. I honestly think Cruz Brookins was one of the guys that Pitt fans were looking forward to seeing on Saturday at Acrisure Stadium in the Blue Gold game. I certainly think Pitt fans on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com were excited about it. I think they were looking forward to seeing Brookins because he's been talked up so much. We've talked about him. We've written about him. The players have talked about him. The coaches have talked about him. I think everybody was really excited to see Cruz Brookins. And I think there's probably a little bit of disappointment that he's not going to be participating in this scrimmage. And then also there's a bunch of the transfers in here too. Sincere Lee and Raphael Williams, the 2 wide receivers who transferred, ultimately both from Western Carolina, although Williams spent last year at San Diego State where he had to sit out. And then Key Thompson, the linebacker. That's 3 of the – and Tamon Lynham, the cornerback from Nebraska. So that's 4 of the transfers Pitt brought in this offseason, 4 guys who are going to be counted on, you would think. And they're not going to be available. You're not going to get to see them. And you've heard some talk about Lee and Williams, about how explosive they've been and the plays they've been making. Well, we're not going to see it on Saturday. So that's a little bit of a disappointment. It's unfortunate about Jordan Bass and Solomon DeShields. I think those guys are going to play a lot this season. Obviously, Rodney Hammond is a prominent player. And then you've got, at least 2, if not 3 starting offensive linemen. And Terrence Moore, Branson Taylor, and then Ryan Jacoby. And Jacoby's been out, since last season, still kind of coming back from an injury. But he's not expected to miss any time. And that's the thing about this whole list. When we talk about 18 guys, 19 guys who are out for the spring game, plus 5 who are probable and 1 who's questionable. Probably none of those are season-ending injuries. Probably none of those are anything that you really need to be concerned about heading into next season. In the spring, coaches tend to err on the side of caution. Coaches tend to be extra cautious with guys who are hurt or banged up. You don't want to have a small injury turn into a big one during spring camp. If it happens during the season, it happens during the season. But during spring camp, there's no point in that. There's no point in pushing it and trying to get a guy back out there if he's less than 100%. So I think they're trying to be extra cautious. And certainly with guys like Branson Taylor, Terrence Moore, Solomon DeShields, Rodney Hammond, they're being careful with those guys because they're going to count on those guys this season. They're going to need those guys to play prominent roles this season. As far as probable players, Derek Davis, Sean Fitzsimmons, Francis Brew, Nakai Johnson, Israel Polk, a few guys that were certainly of high interest there. Hopefully they can all get out there and play. And then Tamarian Crumpley is questionable, the cornerback. Pat Narduzzi said he just needs to get into the trainer's room, and then he should be okay. But we'll see what develops there. As far as these, well, I mean, for one thing, when you look at that injury list, you've got some questionable defensive tackle depth. Particularly when you talk about like the guys who are probable, Fitzsimmons, Brew, and Nakai Johnson. I mean, those are three guys who would certainly play a lot in the spring game, and will, at least Fitzsimmons and Johnson will be two deep players, if not starters. Starting defensive tackles in the season. So it's a little disappointing to not be able to see them. And then Francis Brew is a guy who, as a true freshman who enrolled early, I think people were excited about. It really kind of cuts in on the gold team, I'll tell you, because the gold team has 4 defensive tackles, and 2 of them are Fitzsimmons and Brew. So that could cut them down a little bit. And, the blue team's not all that different. They have 3 guys, and one of them is Nakai Johnson. Now, if Johnson doesn't go, that still leaves the blue team with Nick James and Isaiah Neal. That should be a pretty solid duo. For the gold team, if Fitzsimmons and Brew don't play, you're looking at Elliott Donald and walk-on Will King. That's not a great combination. Now, fortunately for the gold team, they have Deion Hayes and Sincere Edwards at defensive end. That's much better than the blue team's combination of Nate Matlack and Bam Brema and Jimmy Scott. I think there's some good players in there, but Deion Hayes and Sincere Edwards, I mean, Hayes is the leader of the defensive ends. I think Matlack will probably be the other starter, but Edwards has made a lot of noise. He's gonna have a chance to play this season, and I think he's gonna be really good in his career. And those guys are going to be going up against that sort of second-team offensive line. Specifically at tackle, they're going to be going against Tyree and Isaiah Montgomery, a couple of redshirt freshmen against Deion Hayes and Sincere Edwards. Edwards is a true freshman, but that's a matchup that favors the gold defense, I would say. And the blue quarterbacks are going to be probably under some pressure. Blue quarterbacks are Nate Yarnell, Christian Bayer, Julian Duggar, and David Lynch. Now, the interesting thing about that, and this is one of the interesting storylines, I think, is when the draft happened, and I want to bring up the draft order, the quarterbacks, like I say, they draft by positions. So it went X receivers, then defensive ends, then cornerbacks, then safeties, running backs, middle linebackers, and then quarterbacks. So how many positions is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So position number 7. And it was opened by the blue team. They took Nate Yarnell. The gold team, obviously, they have 2 choices, right? 3. You have 4. You have 4 other scholarship quarterbacks. You have, Christian Bayer, who started some games last year and won that Louisville game. You have Ty Diefenbach, who's a redshirt freshman. Eli Holstein, who's a redshirt freshman, as a transfer from Alabama, and Julian Duggar, the true freshman who enrolled early this January from Penn Hills. And so, with all those options, the gold team sat back and said, Eli Holstein. And obviously, what's notable about that is taking Holstein over Christian Bayer. Bayer, the guy with starting experience last year, who's older. He's a redshirt junior this season. It's really interesting. And the gold team captains, Gavin Bartholomew, Daniel Carter, Rashad Battle, and Donovan McMillan. So you've got 4 veteran guys there, obviously. I mean, both teams have seniors as their captains. But am I going to read into it a little bit that Gavin Bartholomew and Daniel Carter said, which quarterback do we want, Eli Holstein or Christian Bayer? And they took Holstein. And we've talked on Panther-Lair.com in our spring camp reports, we've talked about Holstein potentially moving ahead of Bayer on the depth chart, up to number 2 behind Nate Yarnell. It sure sounds to me like if it was up to Gavin Bartholomew and Daniel Carter, not to mention some guys they go against in Rashad Battle and Donovan McMillan, it sure sounds to me like those guys are saying, yeah, we would have Holstein ahead of Bayer too. Pretty interesting stuff. And I think Holstein's certainly going to be one of the main players to watch, one of the most interesting guys to watch, to see how he looks in a game setting. When there's a little bit of pressure, obviously the quarterbacks aren't going to be live. They can't hit the quarterbacks on Saturday. But with a little bit of pressure, how Holstein responds and how he plays in this blue-gold game is going to be really, really interesting to see. And then the last thing I thought that stood out a lot, the last thing that I thought was pretty interesting was where the draft all started, because the first pick of the draft, remember, Gold Team won the right. Gold Team had Donovan McMillan go rock, paper, scissors against Brandon George, and McMillan won rock, paper, scissors, so he had the right. He won the right to call the coin toss, and he called tails. Tails won. Gold Team kept the first pick. Now, they kind of go like a snake draft, so whoever picked first gets to open the first position and make their picks, and then the other team opens the second position and the third position. They get the second round and the third round, the first pick. And so there is some advantage to deferring and taking that second pick. Gold Team opted to keep the first pick, make the first selection, and their first selection was ex-receiver Kenny Johnson. Not a quarterback, not a safety, not defensive end, not any other position. And I mean, granted, they had Donovan McMillan, they had Deion Hayes, so they were in good shape to start those positions, but they chose not to go with those spots, and they went with Kenny Johnson. I think that says something about Kenny Johnson. Now, granted, the blue team already had Kanate Mumfield. He was one of their captains, and so that's already they already had a wide receiver, and maybe the Gold Team looked at it like, we need to get the second best wide receiver, but they certainly prioritized Kenny Johnson by making him the first pick in the draft, and I think that's pretty interesting. I think that's pretty notable, and something to keep in mind. And certainly we'll be interested to see what Kenny Johnson does on Saturday in the blue-gold game, in the scrimmage, catching passes from Eli Holstein, with Gavin Bartholomew lined up on the other side of him, Daniel Carter and Juelz Goff in the backfield. The other wide receivers, Dejon Reynolds, Israel Polk, and then a couple walk-ons, Jake McConaughey and Thaddeus Shaw. But the main weapons there for the Gold Team, Gavin Bartholomew, Kenny Johnson, with the best offensive line, with Jackson Brown, Jason Collier, Lyndon Cooper, B.J. Williams, and Ryan Baer. Gold Team is favored here a little bit. And their defense is pretty stout. They got Hayes and Edwards at defensive end. They've got Kyle Lewis and Braylon Lovelace at linebacker, plus Jeremiah Marcelin. They've got Donovan McMillan and Jesse Anderson at safety. Noah Bigelow and Rashad Battle. Gold Team should probably win this thing. That looks like the stronger lineup to me, but we'll see. We'll see what ends up happening. But all right, that's our little blue gold game preview. We did it today because we'll have the mailbag tomorrow, and the blue gold draft was still fresh in our minds. We've got the links right up there at the top with the projected 2 deep, and then the full rundown of the draft. You can find that all at Panther-Lair.com. The website is right there below, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. The most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet, football, basketball, and recruiting. You find it all at Panther-Lair.com. And of course, message boards to interact with hundreds and thousands of other Pitt fans all day, every day. Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm asking you this last. I'm waiting till the end, but this is what every YouTuber does. I should have done it more at the beginning, but I waited until the end. Like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Hope it's been a great week so far. Hope you enjoy your Thursday. We'll be back with the Morning Pitt mailbag tomorrow, right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.